Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
We have two guests today on the Cognitive Crucible. First is Vic Garcia, who spent 30 years in the U.S. Army in numerous information operations roles, culminating as the J-39 Information Operations Division Chief at two separate combatant commands, U.S. Special Operations Command and U.S. Central Command. Vic currently works for Peraton, supporting information warfighting capability development. Also joining Vic is Dr. Mike Berger, who is the Chief of Research for the Information Warfare Organizational Unit in Peraton's Cyber Mission Sector. In this capacity, Mike serves as the lead for analysis and assessments for the Operational Planning, Implementation, and Assessment Services, or OPIAS contract, which is currently the largest information warfare support contract in the U.S. government. Vic Garcia and Mike Berger, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
So the conversation I'd like to have with you fellas will cover the connection between information operations and intelligence. But before we get into this topic, could we start off by getting from both of you just a real quick assessment of our strategic landscape?
John, I'd like to start. So what we've seen is the United States be confronted with a change in a recognition of who our strategic competitors are. 5 years ago, there was common recognition that it was violent extremist organizations, ISIS in particular, and before that, Al-Qaeda. And we were largely focused on that adversary, how that adversary used information in order to radicalize and their ideology, radicalize folks to their cause, and the effects that was having on our strategic partnerships in the Middle East, but also around the globe. That has changed, and it's a recognition now that we have much more sophisticated strategic competitors, adversaries that we're trying to keep from becoming much more hostile. So China, Russia, Iran, not to dismiss VEOs, but because they are still a threat, but there's recognition that more needs to be done. Those adversaries are using their abilities to erode confidence in the United States as an ally and partner around the globe. And they're doing that in asymmetric ways. And there is some evidence that I think Mike can speak to of that they are collaborating, if not outright coordinating their efforts in the information environment to erode the United States as the partner of choice. There's also recognition that's slowly, coming to us here in the United States by policymakers that we have not fully committed ourselves to competing in the information environment, not nearly to the degree that we competed during the Cold War against an ideological adversary, then the Soviet Union, and conveyed to the world that the United States truly was the partner of choice and our way of life and the freedoms and the human rights that we represented. We're not effectively doing that today. And I think there's growing recognition that we need to do more. So I'll cut myself off.
Yeah, that was Vic Garcia to our audience. Mike, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and just to kind of follow on what Vic's talking about, a lot of the focus, and part of it's because this is, where we sit as practitioners, but a lot of the focus happens in the gray zone of irregular warfare, right? So below the line of armed conflict, we know what's going on in Ukraine, but globally, this battle to build influence, and our adversaries invest a lot of resources in it. The Russians, the Iranians, outspend the U.S. in terms of what we invest in terms of the, if you just look at messaging or PSYOP type messaging, we're somewhere around the U.S. around about $1 billion. It's our whole enterprise of what we invest in, which might sound like a lot, but it's about a little under half of what Geico spends on cheap car insurance in the United States. It's somewhere around a fourth or a fifth of what Coca-Cola spends on their international marketing budget. And that's before you even bring in, the real big daddy in this scenario, which is China. And by most estimates, they're spending over $10 billion. And the amount that they invest as well, when you get beyond just the messaging piece, is staggering. I mean, they have the Belt and Road Initiative to build influence across the globe. And that itself is, I believe, a $4 to $8 trillion effort. So over, I think 20 plus years, but it's the amount that they're investing to build influence worldwide is tremendous. And there's been a head start. We've only begun as a community to start to look at these state actors the last few years. As Vic was saying, we've been myopically focused on VEOs, violent extremist organizations, and to a lesser extent, some, malign influence from Iran, whereas these other players have been able to begin to really posture themselves more and more. And the consequence is that we are in a strongly contested global environment for influence. In some cases, I think you can easily make the argument that we are dominated. And a lot of this takes place in the developing world. We've seen this, for example, in the Middle East, also known as the CENTCOM AOR, where if you look in just about any country in that AOR, you will find that either Russia and or China have majority positive views. The US absolutely doesn't. Or if they don't have majority positive views, it's closer to a plurality and still a lot more than the US. In fact, the only place where that's not the case is Israel and essentially the Kurdish areas of Syria and Iraq, where we have forces there under the auspices of Operation Inherent Resolve. And even in those areas, I hate to tell you, but Russia and China still have strong influence. And so if you look across the globe, there's parts of Africa and Latin America and Asia. Those views are very entrenched. I would say that within the Western context, since the Ukraine war, we have seen a revitalization and a rededication to kind of resisting some of Russia and to a lesser extent China. Maybe a dedication to protecting democracies. You see this in some of our very close democratic Asian partners like Japan and South Korea. But outside of that, very contested, that environment. And then within those environments, within our partners and allies, there is a lot of efforts, to message and divide our societies, to meddle in our elections, et cetera. And in our community, we focus mainly, the foreign policy piece out a lot of times outside of the West, especially outside the U.S. And vice versa. When you talk to people, on the street and they're worried about, propaganda, it's almost all within the context of domestic, and election interference. And there isn't a realization of how much it's touching foreign policy and American interests and Western interests abroad. And I just wrap it up by saying that we're getting to the point where our research is finding that it's not just the big, sort of big baddie type actors like Russia and China either. We have, partners, allies, and other major regional players that are increasingly developing their own messaging apparatuses that often outpace our own. And sometimes we're on the same page and sometimes we're not, right? Sometimes they're not messaging positive things about us with regards to, say, conflict in Ukraine. They don't always paint a pretty picture of us. So it is a space that I would say is becoming increasingly crowded by anyone who aspires to be a power player in the information environment. And it is a struggle, in our community, and I would say for our government to keep pace, especially based on how much others are investing in it and prioritize it.
John, if I may add to that,
Yeah, yeah.
China, I think, is a perfect example of where they truly are implementing all elements of national power across the dime spectrum, right? So diplomatically, informationally, economically, and militarily. And that's being, it's manifested in their whole Belt and Road Initiative, which isn't just in, East Asia. It is across the globe that they are applying these principles in concert with each other. So diplomatic engagement, economic investment, combined with a very robust informational effort to demonstrate to those individual countries one at a time, but in across a region, across the globe, tied together to achieve China's national security interests. And we in the United States, we're not effectively calling that out yet. We're doing that in isolated areas, but it's not a holistic campaign plan on our part to provide an alternative to that Chinese narrative right now.
Yeah, and typically not at scale, the level we need to.
And not close to this scale. And then we see other manifestations of that. And Mike did a wonderful analysis, a report that he co-published that looked at the Chinese narrative with regards to the COVID
disinformation.
Yeah, disinformation that they were putting out and trying to blame the United States as being the originator of that virus. And so it's just one example. And Mike, I thought maybe I'd tee you up to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just without going too deep, because that's a very deep rabbit hole, right? One of the things that we saw was an alignment between Russian and Iranian propaganda around 2011, 2012, during the eruption of the Syrian civil war. And, because both sides were very aligned on keeping Assad in power and opposing the West and the coalition. We saw, though, China typically, and they put a lot of resources, we talked about it, into their propaganda, but for a while it really was just to paint a good picture of China. I think the reference was tell China's story well. Whereas where they would do things like censorship of Hollywood films, and the question you always say is, when's the last time you saw a villain in a Chinese villain in a movie, right? Because they work on censorship. In the US, they make their own films, very large budget, especially on space race. If you saw First Man, which is the retelling of Neil Armstrong, or I believe, what is it, Red Planet or Mars with Matt Damon, congratulations. You've watched a Chinese propaganda film. They would engage in kind of a way to provide a positive spin in terms of China and Chinese interests, but they kind of stayed out of this more malign disinformation fight, and they would give positive coverage. So Xinhua, which is well read throughout, say, the Middle East, they may cover stories linked to areas or items of interest linked to Russia and Iran that they gave positively, but they didn't delve too hard into the conspiracy theories. We saw a major realignment of that when COVID-19 came out. And when COVID came out, you suddenly saw China beginning to align with much more with Russia and Iran, and studies came out just showing how much alignment in terms of a lot of the propaganda that the Chinese were pushing out carried a lot of Russian and Iranian propaganda pieces. But it was more than just carrying their pieces. You could see them coordinated within time, within a day, across days, across a month, pushing out different stories. So you would see the Russians release a story through one of their front organizations for news. You'd see the Chinese picking it up at a senior level, right? And you'd see a foreign ministry spokesperson would pick up the story and then would release it very publicly. And then you'd see all the Chinese media apparatuses, which have hundreds of millions of viewers across the globe, would push out this information. And then going deep into an AOR, like in the Middle East, you would see Iran-aligned militia groups, Shia militia groups, taking out this propaganda and pushing it very specifically in local provinces, and they would all kind of take the spin of, well, this is why we need to get the U.S. out of this area. They did this a lot in Iraq or Syria. This is why the U.S. government has to leave, because it's actually the U.S. military that created COVID and that is spreading it now in these societies. So you would see this. It would be the global narrative, but it would also become very localized and tailored locally. And we've continued to see it, throughout the creation of vaccines. We've seen it with Ukraine, where Chinese propaganda, despite their public statements that they're neutral, their propaganda remains very much pro-Russian. And so it just adds to this, really considerable force that we're up against when we're trying to push across a narrative. And it's a reason why we see, when you look in many of the countries, across the globe that aren't Western, you will find either individuals and surveys that are done blaming the United States principally for the war in Ukraine, or the Ukrainians for Nazis there versus the Russians. Or if they blame the Russians, they see it as, hey, they didn't have a choice. They were forced to this by essentially US and NATO aggression. And these are stories that get pushed very heavily. And you see it out in Asia. The Chinese themselves have been using the demonization that Russia does with NATO in order to try to prevent any NATO-like entity in Asia, like say one of the entities is the Quad or AUKUS, where you have the US and India, Australia, United Kingdom working together, Japan. The reason why they're pushing so hard is to kind of demonize perceptions towards this and discourage this formation. But you see an alignment across the board of disinformation on this.
And if I just jump in there, so the end result is we're starting to see the effects of that and how it affects our national objectives in our foreign policy, particularly in places like the United Nations, that are collaborative bodies. And now the United States is increasingly viewed in a much more hostile fashion, in a way that we have not seen before. And so that's starting to impact our policymakers' freedom of maneuver, if you will, and their ability to engage the international community in a way as either being the partner of choice or being the bringer of positive human rights, the defender of the global commons, building, coalitions of the willing in order to, bring positive global order.
Right.
And
well,
I'm seeing that challenge now.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to ask you guys about that. Serendipitously, this discussion is going to be coming out on Tuesday, February 28th, which is right at the kickoff of the Phoenix Challenge in London. And IPA is really grateful to be a major part of the Phoenix Challenge conference series, which is sponsored by the United States Department of Defense Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. But this particular conference is very special in that it's in London and it's co-sponsored by the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense. So I guess I wanted to mention that, number one, but number two, ask you guys to comment, and both of you were just touching on this, but the importance of partnerships as we collectively engage in this problem space.
Yeah, I would say critically important. The United States has never operated alone throughout our history, and we shouldn't start anytime soon. Our partnerships are vital to us, and we share common objectives with not just our British allies, but with allies throughout NATO, throughout the Far East, and in other places around the globe in terms of freedom of navigation, common understanding of trade and trade practices. All of that is what has enabled the world that we get to enjoy today, that is relatively peaceful and has led to the prosperity and growth for countries around the world. I mean, look at South Korea as a perfect example. At the end of the Korean conflict in the 1950s to where South Korea is today, and how much they have benefited from this environment of global trade and of their relationship with the United States. That's just one example, and there are examples like that around the globe, and that's what I think most Americans, frankly, take for granted. But it's critically important that we approach this using our allies and partners, and that's just my take, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, no, you're going to get no argument out of me that using allies and partners is absolutely critical. In part because, as we talked about, we're just so outgunned in terms of resources that we need everyone to pitch in with this. And in part too, that in a lot of cases, they are the best postured to convey that message. And often if it's within their own country, they're certainly oftentimes the most credible. When we were countering the Islamic State and Operation Inherent Resolve, a lot of our success in Iraq was our cooperation with the Iraqi government, the Iraqi MOD. And so we completely endorse the notion of going through partners. But I would say on there, I've also seen sometimes in our community the temptation to see just general kind of partner coordination as the panacea. And it's just kind of, we'll just hand it off. There's a couple challenges with that. First, most of our partners invest quite a bit less than we do. And I already talked about how we're already on a much smaller scale of investment than a lot of our adversaries. The US, the UK, to an extent France, and it starts to drop off quite a bit in terms of investments amongst a lot of our partners in this space. So one piece is we need the capability, because just compiling as many partners as we can, unfortunately, it's still not going to make up that delta, that difference between us and some of these actors. The second is that a lot of times our partners rely on our inputs and training to help get them there, or to see what we've done as a model, because it's hard for them to compile that investment for themselves. And then the third case that I always like to point out is that not all of our partners, and sometimes not even all of our allies, right, see eye to eye with us on all of their, our strategic objectives. So a great example of it is Islamic State. That was almost a no-brainer, even in some cases for our adversaries or competitors, to say, yeah, well, we don't like these guys. We should be working together, or at least, we're going to work against them. When you start getting to more kind of influence-based or strategic interests, Western interests, Western values, American interests, values, right? There isn't always a complete lineup, especially as you get outside of Western countries, as you get outside of, maybe very close allies. And while you may cooperate with some partners, I'm not going to call any out on this podcast, right? But yeah, when you get to a point where maybe you have a difference of national perspective on a certain issue, you can find very quickly those partners that you're relying on now sort of, flipping the script and hitting you pretty hard. And, the one I will say, which is just because it's publicly known, the example was when we were liberating the Middle Euphrates River Valley, the MERV, in Syria, back in 2017, 2018, we found that a lot of the Turkish and Qatari-backed press essentially cast, the liberation led by the group that we were backing, the Syrian Democratic Forces. They spun it as we were conducting a ethnic genocide of local Arabs. And so there may have been alignment on ISIS is bad, but there wasn't necessarily an alignment on terms of what the solution was itself. And that itself undermined, perspectives of the local population regarding the coalition and coalition activities. So again, 100% on board with partners are the answer, but also just qualifying it, they're not the complete answer, and there's some reasons for that.
Right. Everything that you fellows are saying I'm not going to recap it all, but I think you can just like put all of this into the not very easy bucket for everything that we're grappling with. And my sources tell me, just FYI, that for this upcoming Phoenix Challenge, there's going to be at least 7 or 8 different nations represented there. So lots of good dialogue, I'm sure, that can come from all that. Okay, well, great introduction, fellas. So I'd like to start stepping into some of the other items that we wanted to talk about. So the relationship between information operations and intelligence. Would one of you like to start out and talk to our audience about why this is an important topic?
Yeah, thanks, John. This is critically important to me as a practitioner in the field for almost 20 years specifically, and as an infantryman before that. And the first thing I like to say is that I'm an intelligence lover, right? I reach out and I embrace the intelligence community and request their support. But unfortunately, the intelligence community has not embraced back. And that's in part because of a lack of understanding and training, I think, from the intelligence community and how best to support information operations, or now known as operations in the information environment. But it's also on our end, it's also our inability to effectively communicate to the intelligence community what our needs and requirements are. So there is, 2 sides to that definitely needs improvement. What I'd like to do is share a couple of vignettes of where, when we had Intel, it enabled us to do our influence operations much better than had we not received that intelligence operation or
Right.
that intelligence support.
Yeah, excellent, Vic. And just before you do that,
Sure.
do you think maybe just for some people in our audience that might be a little bit less familiar with the lay of the land within a military command, there's directorates, right,
Sure.
within commands. Do you think you could just give a real quick 101 so that those folks can follow along a little better?
Sure. So the intelligence community generally falls under the J2, and their responsibility is to collect intelligence on our adversaries, support targeting efforts, that then those insights then drive operations. Operations falls under the J3 directorate, and that's a directorate that is responsible for the execution of the missions, whether that's destroying an adversary or combating them in the information environment. All of that falls under the purview of the J3. The 2 working in concert then to meet the mission and in support of the commander, who is ultimately the decision maker on how to proceed and what transpires against the adversary in that environment.
Excellent. Okay, cool.
So the vignette I like to share is an experience that I had going back to 2007, 2008 in Iraq. I was the leader of the Information Operations Task Force in support of multinational forces Iraq, then led by General David Petraeus.
And I want to say, just because Vic is probably too humble to say it, but it was probably the largest information campaign undertaken by the U.S. government since World War II. So go ahead, Vic.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So this was a clandestine effort, and we were using a multiple number of lines of effort. But one of those lines of efforts were against then Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, which was, again, trying to radicalize primarily the Sunni population, the Sunni Islamic population of Iraq, and turn them against the United States and against other folks in the region. And they were being quite successful. So what our line of effort was, what we're trying to do is create a wedge between the hardcore AQI leadership and their support base that was coming primarily from the Sunni nationalists, the Iraqi Sunni nationalists within the country. And we had an ongoing messaging campaign that used a variety of different means, television commercials primarily, but supported with print and radio. And we started to see some effects, and we used traditional research methodologies to see that, quantitative and qualitative studies that came back to us. And the polls indicated that we were seeing a change. My responsibility was to brief General Petraeus on a monthly basis. And, he would take interest and always liked seeing the products, the types of products we were putting out there. But I never saw him open up his notebook until I started to integrate some of the intelligence indicators that we were getting. So as part of my role as leading that organization, I held a weekly targeting meeting, invited folks from the intelligence community to join in to that discussion. And slowly over time, they started to understand what we were trying to do and started to share with me intelligence reports that they thought were indicative of support of what we were doing. And it was powerful. It was particularly powerful in one case where we had an AQI senior leader asking his leadership for additional funds because all the Iraqi nationals had walked out on him. Now, mind you, this was before the Sons of Iraq stood up and we saw the Sunni turn happen in Iraq. So we got an indicator on that. And then we had another interrogation report come back from an Iraqi national. And he was asked about AQI and in very colorful language, talked about how AQI was not supportive of Iraq, didn't care about the Iraqi people, and actually realized that it was that realization that Al-Qaeda was not working in their interest. And what was interesting was he closed out by actually using the tagline from our television commercial series that we had out. So I bundled that together and then briefed General Petraeus the next month. And that was the first time that I saw General Petraeus open his little black book and start to take notes. And then soon after had folks from the intelligence community, senior folks now, come down to meet with us to discuss some of the findings that we were seeing. And again, this was all before the emergence of the Sons of Iraq. And I'm clearly not trying to take credit that was, wholly the result of the IO task force. I'm just saying our efforts contributed to that outcome. And that was the epiphany for me that senior leaders really, they're interested in the traditional research methodologies, but it's when you start to integrate intelligence indicators that really makes it important and makes it real to them that we are actually having effects in the information environment. So that was, for me, how Intel supported our assessment efforts. Another quick vignette on how Intel supported our understanding of the environment and enabled us to take action happened more recently in Iraq against ISIS, where intelligence indicators were coming back that ISIS intended to blow up the Grand Mosque in Mosul as the Iraqi forces approached, and then they were going to blame the United States as the cause of that explosion at the mosque, trying to turn the Muslim population once again, against the United States. Because we had that intelligence, we were able to coordinate with our interagency partners from the State Department all the way up to the national security staff, and enabled us to start to inoculate the populations, not just regionally, but globally, that ISIS had this intention, that as Iraqi forces entered into Iraq, the Grand Mosque was going to be destroyed, and there was going to be an effort that it was the result from the United States, and that it was not true. As a result of that inoculation, when that event did in fact happen, it didn't gain any traction. People understood, and we were already poised with a response to point the finger right back at ISIS and placing the blame where it belonged, at ISIS. So again, that was only enabled because of intelligence support to the information operations community that could then start to develop and take action. 2 quick vignettes. Hopefully that helps illustrate why we think this is so important and why it's critical that we evolve and get better intelligence support to IO and train professionals from both communities on how to better interact with each other.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Vic. That really does illuminate the dynamics and where things have been, where things are, and where things are going. So a big topic that has come up on this podcast a number of times, and we'll have links in the show notes to some of the episodes which talk about assessments, information operations assessments. So I would love to get both of your take on this big topic. Is it desirable to be able to assess the information effects? And some people argue that it's not even possible. So would love to get both of your opinions on this.
So yes, it is. It is certainly is both. It's not only desirable; it's essential, and it's possible. So at least within Department of Defense, most funding for our activities in the realm of MISO, also known as Military Information Support Operations, or Psychological Operations (PSYOP), is a congressional special interest item. In other words, we have our own specific line item that funds our activities, and they receive quarterly review and an annual report. And we have to enter that into a common system these days called C2IE, Command and Control of the Information Environment. And so just to begin, it is an essential requirement to start. Assessments are certainly possible. I've heard the argument, well, can you really see it? And it will boil down to things like, we aren't the commercial sector, so when we do messaging, it doesn't result in a sale. Our brand of cereal hasn't gotten more sales, and it's not an election specifically in terms of your guy didn't get voted for into office, right?
Right, and every time someone changes their mind, a bell doesn't go off saying, "Hey, all right, you changed somebody's mind."
That's right. It's more in an ethereal realm of shifting attitudes and behaviors as the bottom line of that, right? And we can evaluate that. It is, partly a process that involves looking at clearly delineating on the planning side, what are the objectives that you're trying to achieve? What effects are you trying to create? And then in terms of the evaluation side of setting up a clear baseline, and that usually your baseline to the evaluation of what you're achieving involves a combination of opinion research, of operational data, of intelligence reporting, and both, it has quantitative and qualitative data. It has traditional research sources and more modern, AI-enabled solutions, including machine learning and natural language processing. But at the end of the day, you're trying to baseline a specific attitude or behavior that we are attempting to shift. It could be in the general population. It could be among an adversary audience. And then we begin to evaluate what are the, we used to call information related capabilities, it's now moving towards information forces, but what are the the components of IO that you have implemented to make the change, and then being able to measure the performance of those capabilities and being able to connect that change over time. Now, what you can't do, and where you get a lot of this argument of that it's impossible, within the social sciences, you cannot prove causality. And so a lot of people hear that and they say, well, okay, I'm checking out. I'm not going to be able to show you anymore. But that's not what an assessment is in our field, really. What it is a sound, logic-driven argument that is, that contains evidence in terms of here's what we did, here's the extent we did it, here's how we reached the audience, here's how they received the information, how they consumed it and responded to it. And then here are the effects that we saw overlapping in the same or similar space and time, and the changes in attitudes and behavior. And you can do quasi-experimental designs. You could say, okay, well, in this area, this geographic area where we didn't message, we didn't see this change, right? In this forum where we messaged online, you saw changes, but you did not see them in the control group. And we also end up looking at what are called exogenous variables. So those are external influences, right? So maybe you're doing something with attitudes on country X. Well, country X invades another small country, and all of a sudden, your target audience starts having really negative views of country X, and more positive views of you. Is that because we did anything particularly effective in the information environment? Maybe not. It may just be because there was a big historic event that changed perspectives. Maybe there was an earthquake in the country, right? There are different external factors that can impact it. It can also be your adversary's own major attempt. So maybe you found that they had a major bot campaign going on and they spiked their own influence there. So you have to consider the external factors, and then what you do is you make a structured argument. I was listening to one of your prior podcasts here, and I want to try to give them a shout out. I think it was John DeRosa and Alex Castillo. They talked about process tracing, and I smiled when I heard that, because it is a qualitative research method, usually in case study analysis. And it is a very powerful tool for a lot of assessments we do. So what I often tell people is the assessment is a structured qualitative analysis to show, essentially you are alleging causality by showing a cause and effect, right? You are saying here, we are making a claim that there was a causal effect. We can't prove it. We're making a claim. We're going to walk you through the factors that led to it. It incorporates a lot of sophisticated quantitative data to make that claim. And some of it's traditional research, some of it may be backed by machine learning or more sophisticated AI methods to say, hey, we're looking at 1 million communications, 10 million communications. We're going to quantify it. We're going to run a series of correlations, and we're going to show you how much we looked at the whole universe of where we were messaging, how much response there was, and what shifts we saw from the baseline. But at the end of the day, you're essentially walking through the reasoning behind this argument, and you're building up the evidence. And what the passing grade is in our field is very clear. The passing grade is that the congressional staffers who are reviewing it are satisfied with the evaluation we've done, or that the joint staff, now that we're having centralization of funding resources, that they're satisfied with the return on the investment for the United States towards this. And that is determined largely by the effectiveness of what we've been doing. And so having done it for years now, in fact, I would say that I've probably run the largest assessment portfolio for DoD information operations the last 6 or so years. I can tell you it's definitely possible. It's doable. And it's essential. I think it's just a lot of times people will either check out when they say, well, you can't prove causality, or they think it's such an esoteric, overly, quantitative or technical solution that it's so hard to wrap your head around. But really, it is a fairly straightforward, logic-driven process from what are your objectives and effects is linked to, in our lots of times our theater campaign, but to national security objectives. What are the clear desired effects? What are the capabilities you're going to implement to achieve it? And then setting out that that baseline, right, of how you're going to determine what the performance is, but what are the attitudes, what's just the behavior, what's the elements of the environment you're seeking to change, and evaluating it and sticking to, some basic stuff, smart objectives, right? Are they specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and time bound, I believe is.
I think that's it. Yeah.
That's right. Are they, and you go even shorter. Is it observable, measurable, and achievable? And if the answer is no, then you need to go back and reevaluate your objectives. But you can come up with some pretty good assessments as long as you stick by that approach.
And John, if I could just add to that, it is critically important that your assessment criteria be developed as part of your plan at the very beginning of your planning process. Not only in order to establish a baseline, but to have it, what I like to say, it needs to be baked in. It can't be sprinkled on top after the cake's already been baked.
Yep.
It's critically important that you have that understanding of what effects are you trying to create with the respective target audiences, and how do you intend to collect on that body of evidence. And so, to Mike's point, it's often very difficult to show direct causality. It happens rarely. It does happen on occasion, surrender appeal leaflets, for instance, and then having, enemy soldiers walking in holding the surrender leaflet. That's one direct causal. But most of the time, you can't show that direct causality. So this is where you have to make a circumstantial evidentiary argument, just like you would in a court of law, where now it's the preponderance of the evidence helps you lead to a logical conclusion. And what you're trying to do is build the mosaic of understanding. And that's where I come back again to why intelligence is such an important contributor to that, because quantitative and qualitative research, critically important. When you start to layer in intelligence indicators as well, now you have a much more complete picture of what's happening in the information environment against that particular target audience. And that's then where you can make the claim that you are creating effects in support of your command's objectives. And so this is, I think, some of the successes that Mike and I have witnessed and have helped lead, which has led to growth in our budgets, is because we deliberately planned the assessment approach at the start of our planning effort, not just about how we were going to communicate to those target audiences, but how we were going to assess it as well.
Right. Is there any value in really rough here, right? Is there any value in segmenting the assessment space into like long-term effects and short-term effects? So I can envision, like some kind of like a relatively near-term like stimulus response kind of a dynamic, which can be observed in the information environment. And this is a silly, like unrelated example, but if you stick your finger into an ant bed, you're going to see a whole bunch of ants come out, and then after an hour or two, they go back in and they go about their business, right? So that's a short-term stimulus response, but then you have long-term effects. Can one of you kind of like shine a light into that dynamic?
Yeah, so I mean, yes, it's necessary to have effect or assessments at both levels, and we often do that to an extent. The problem is that your resources can get overwhelmed very quickly if you get too into the weeds on all the different activities that you're doing. Usually, and it's also hard to show effect because a lot of times your effect is coming not as each of these individual tactical activities, but as essentially the aggregate of that effort. So one of the things that we say, in our community on the assessments end, which is frustrating, is, people like, what did that billboard do? What did that leaflet do? What did that one tweet do? And that's not really the point, right? On those, it's fine to gather measures of performance and, say, okay, well, this tweet got so many likes or retweets, and, here was the percentage of positive versus negative comments, et cetera. But that's really a bit of it's to inform really the broader assessment of where you're going. What was the aggregate effect of what you were building with these activities? So usually your most productive assessment ends up being at what was the objective you were trying to achieve? How did this contribute, to your commander's campaign plan and then higher national objectives? And when you get congressional staffers in or GAO auditors, that's what they want to know, right? They don't necessarily want to know that on this specific forum, you had people spreading less radical material, for a week or something. It's how do you connect this to the higher level? Now, with that being said, again, you do need that because you want to know what your return on investment are for these individual activities, but you have to be careful of how low you're going here. I mean, is it every single dissemination? It really shouldn't be, because first, you're going to overwhelm your evaluation capability. And I've seen this happen before where the assessments folks are just scrambling to look at all these individual items rather than taking care of the aggregate effect. And that's where it often should be the case. But you often aren't going to see impacts, or there'll be an occasional vignette. And so if you're so stuck in the weeds, when you're only seeing performance in vignettes, oftentimes it's because you're such a tactical level of looking at what's happening. So you need to kind of zoom out a bit and take a look at what's going on, right? And evaluate. Again, here's your baseline, here's the changes. When you're at such a tactical level, it's difficult to do that.
Yeah, I would characterize it as we're undergoing an enduring communications campaign against target audiences. And that's over a longer period of time. And that's where you have to have that understanding. Where the rapid part comes in is when you're having to evaluate adversary activity and how adversary activity may be disrupting what's happening in the information environment. I use the example of the Red Wedding episode, the allegation that the United States had bombed a wedding party in Yemen through one of our drone strikes, right?
This was what time period again?
December 2014.
Okay, very specific. Okay.
Yep.
Yes.
I remember because I was at CENTCOM and had to live through it. And this was an example of where our adversaries took an action in the information environment that completely disrupted what we on the United States side were trying to achieve. And they did it very effectively. A series of tweets got picked up by regional media, which then got picked up by international media. And the allegation that the United States had struck a wedding party, gained worldwide attention. The problem was it was a completely false narrative. But at the time, President Obama directed an investigation which shut down U.S. military operations for an extended period of time, a matter of months, while the investigation was conducted, only to conclude that it was actually a righteous strike. The strike occurred against Al-Qaeda operators operating in Yemen in a rural environment with no civilians around, and it targeted and took out enemy operators. But that narrative, the truthful narrative, doesn't gain traction. And so our ability to understand the rapid environment as well, especially what the adversary is putting out in terms of disinformation, is critically important to us as well.
Right. Yeah. So, one of the really critical projects that I perceive as a need, especially for the West, is this mind. And you kind of touched upon this a bit when you were recapping, Vic, your story with General Petraeus, et cetera. General Petraeus, eventually he started taking notes when he started perceiving value from information operations. But the big project is a mindset shift from a kinetic mindset to influence mindset, or blending them as well. And one's appropriate at one time, another appropriate, more of an enduring engagement, and then there can be this interchange between the two. And I can really see someday a that kind of like short-term influence, and observing short-term influence, like that stimulus response kind of a influence, and then combining that in a maneuver campaign. It's like, so we have stimulated ecosystems or environments that are similar to this, and we've done it many times, and we know that when we do this, the environment tends to react in this way, and that can feed into like a more of a short-term operation plan, so that interplay between like the J2 and the J39 and the J3 starts becoming more of like integrated information maneuver, kind of a influence kinetic maneuver plan. Do you guys foresee that kind of thing happening, or maybe it's already happening?
It's happened, but not often enough.
Mm-hmm.
We have achieved some of those successes, but just like every military operation, you have a turnover of personnel over time, and you start to lose some of those best practices that were successful in the past. And it's just the unfortunate reality is that these lessons aren't yet institutionalized, not in the IO or PSYOP communities, and not in the intelligence community. It's really it's been ad hoc in nature, and there have been successes. The question becomes, how do we start to institutionalize this so it becomes a matter of routine practice? And we're not there yet.
Yeah, and I'd kind of add, part of it is within there's flaws on both sides, right? But within the intelligence community is the prioritization of their resources ends up being a big challenge. So we will find plenty of people in the intelligence community who want to help us and do help us the best they can, and within the DoD, that would be within the J2 apparatus. We often find no shortage of analysts. The problem is that the collections do not typically focus on issues aligned to the information environment. As we, as we talked about before, a lot of it is pattern of life and targeting, right? And countering VEOs. And there's been inertia in shifting it. But second, the priorities within the information operations community often do not make the cut for that dedication of resources. And you see that if you begin and plan, usually when your first steps is, if you're in the operations, you go and request the JIPO, that's the Joint Intelligence Preparation of the Operational Environment. That used to be known as the IPB, the Intelligence Preparation of the Battlefield. And you would pull this up, and there's supposed to be in there a PMEZ breakdown, I think, which stands for like political, military, economic, social, information, and infrastructure, something like that. And the information part should give you everything you know to essentially compile a plan, and then you should be able to tap on the J2 to get assessments. Well, that's not how it works, because they don't have a lot of the resources or focus to map out that information environment. And so the irony is actually the J39 has become a huge supplier of the J2 as opposed to vice versa. So we work with them.
Is that right?
Yeah, and we conduct a lot of research in these areas, including denied and semi-denied areas. Surveys, focus groups, social media monitoring, you name it, AI-based analytics of the information environment. And some of our biggest consumers are actually within the J2 community. And they take our, and it's not just like for their immediate operations, they take our stuff and use it. It goes all the way up, to SecDef and the chairman. And they are relying on it because we have ended up filling a gap because we have built so much money towards it. The example that I often tell people is I oversee the largest foreign audience opinion research budget in the Department of Defense. Well, we had to build that so that we can inform our plans and do our assessments, because we often can't get that on the J2 side. And if you ask a lot of folks there, they understand it. It's why we work with them closely and provide it for them. But they still aren't getting that, support, I think, in their own community to prioritize things like what is the information environment? What are attitudes and perspectives? How can we affect it? So there is a prioritization piece in there. And we work together, but it isn't quite looking the way we would like it. There are efforts, don't get me wrong. I know that there are efforts going on to try to align these things, but a lot of times where the rubber hits the road is that you find willing analysts and individuals, but as soon as you get to collections, there's a lot of inertia in terms of saying making it the targeting process, finding ways to eliminate bad guys isn't your priority. It is what's influence. And as we shift, as the national security strategy shifts and the national defense strategy, the priorities of our country shift from the era that Vic talked about, which was very VEO centric, to one that's much more in the gray zone, dealing with major state actors and strategic competitors. That's the space where we need more of that collection and more of that support. And it's been slow going. So that's often where we have to try to fill those gaps.
Before I forget, Vic, really interesting analog to what you were just describing, Mike. We had a great discussion with Elliot Jardines, who is a OSINT expert, converting publicly available information into actionable intelligence. And in this discussion, he, like you were just describing, Vic, he says that the presidential briefing book is increasingly being fed by intelligence, which is open, or which is originally from publicly available information, just as you were describing some of IO related content becoming increasingly important for the operators, the J3.
That's exactly the point. I just wanted to add on Mike's point is that unfortunately, it's still not institutionalized. So the successes that we've had, as Mike mentioned, has been very personality based. And the reality is there are still those folks, and dare I say, particularly at the more senior levels, that are still not convinced that IO really does make a difference. And so they are frequently reluctant to accept the research studies that we get back. I've even had instances where I've had senior leaders, poking me in the chest saying, "Hey, Garcia, why are you trying to do my job?" And my response was, "Sir, I'm not trying to do your job. I'm doing my job." And I found that these results were significant and wanted to share them with the broader community. So there is still reluctance at many times at a senior level within the intelligence community to accept what the IO community is bringing to the table in terms of our own analysis and our own research methodologies. Not that we're trying to replace the intelligence, we're just contributing to the understanding of the overall picture.
Right. And again, Vic, another analog there in the Elliot Jardines episode where he too expresses some long-term frustration, I suppose, with the intelligence community, from his perspective, adopting and really leaning into leveraging publicly available information into actionable intelligence. So to our audience, I would love to get an intelligence professional onto the podcast to talk about the intelligence perspective, especially as it relates to the conversation that we've been having here. Part of the agenda for the Cognitive Crucible podcast is to have all kinds of different perspectives and people who are earnest and doing a great job, but to cover these topics from all kinds of different perspectives. So open invitation there.
And I do want to just add on that, John. It is very powerful when you get the collaboration, right? Because simply not having the collaboration can often invalidate the findings, even if we have multiple research and operational observation points. Just simply having a skeptical J2 on it, that wants to say, hey, we haven't seen evidence of this. And I came from the J2 before I got into this community. Oftentimes that just means that they weren't looking for that type of information, right? It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But simply having them take a hard line, a commander is going to take a moment and say, well, maybe I shouldn't believe this too much if there's that doubt. So just getting them, first of all, having acceptance is huge, even if they have nothing to bring to the table. I mean, that itself is big. But if they're able to bring verifying information and say, we've seen some of this too, then that is where you get a point of agreement and understanding from a 4-star commander that they're willing to take all the way to the top, and they're willing to take major action on. So it is a major boon to our community when you can have that happen.
We have that degree of collaboration for sure.
Yeah. Well, hey, fantastic discussion, fellas. This has gone a bit longer than most of our podcasts, but which is fine. This is obviously a very, very important, complex topic that is right there at the heart of some of the biggest challenges that we're facing today. And so I'm glad that you guys are thoughtfully engaging. So I'd like to close out, if I may. I ask a couple of closeout questions typically, and so from one or both of you, would love to get a research topic that a student might investigate further that's either related to this whole discussion space or something else that is important that may not be as closely related, and then also a book that you could suggest to our audience.
For the research question, I would offer, I mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative and China's influence efforts, tying together diplomatic, informational, military, and economic means to achieve influence around the globe. So having students look at that through the lens of how are they exerting influence, how are they building their capabilities, and how is that affecting the United States?
Yeah, and it's similar to where I was going to go with that. Our adversaries have invested so many resources. We talked about this at the beginning of the podcast. They've invested so much resources in building influence, in discrediting us in the information space, that it's hard for us to even track how much they're doing across the globe and what the impacts of that are and the effects of that with local societies, regional societies, et cetera. And so, I mean, there's a huge opportunity, if you want to name just about any country, to look and say, where are our adversaries operating? What are they doing, with influence? How are they building it? It would be, all of those would be of value. And it probably is no surprise, the US government has focused on some areas where they've done a lot of research: Iraq, Syria, Ukraine, and Afghanistan, right? Are they just obvious reasons. Pretty much when you get outside of that, though, there is lots of opportunity where if you did a study, you may be the only one providing that information. That might be value to publish. It certainly would be value for insights in our field, and we could always use it. So anytime anyone puts their time towards that, at least in our community, it is of high value. Did you also ask about a book?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
So I have, and I'll give you the two books that I would think of. So the first, speaking of China and Belt and Road Initiative, is the 100-Year Marathon by Michael Pillsbury. If people haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. It gives a long discussion about kind of the journey that the U.S. has gone through in dealing with the People's Republic of China, and dealing with the Chinese Communist Party and the methods of influence and the emphasis that they put on it. The second one, and I know you have one, but there's a second, just because we talked about assessments and process tracing. So if you want to learn about case study analysis, structured focus comparisons, and process tracing, which is an element I've always brought into when I've done assessments. And we incorporate all the very quantitative methods and technical approaches, but looking at it from this social scientific perspective to see from baseline to shifts, I recommend that people read the book Case Studies and Theory Development in the Social Sciences by Alexander George and Andrew Bennett. So those would be the two that I wanted to recommend.
And I have two as well.
Excellent.
So the book I would recommend, although it's getting increasingly dated, but it's still, I think, very valuable in providing insights. It's the book Like War, The Weaponization of Social Media by P.W. Singer and Emerson T. Brooking. And then with regards to intelligence support to information operations, there's a fantastic RAND study published in 2020 by Michael Schwill and Christopher Paul and several other authors, but that was an excellent study of this particular problem.
All right. Well, excellent suggestions. You guys really appreciate it. And I know that the Cognitive Crucible audience wishes you and your colleagues Godspeed as you continue to grapple and engage in this problem space. And with that, Vic Garcia and Mike Berger, thank you both so much for being guests on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John. Have a great day.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.